And we just, and we didn't have a complete breakup of the country. And we inherited then a civil service that just went on working. You know, the crown was substituted by a harp. And those who set up our governmental institutions, almost without considering it, set them up on a British pattern. And what has happened is that although we here in Ireland are in many ways a different people, in a different scale and that sort of thing, we have worked those in a slightly different way, but it appears that the institutions do on the whole, I say on the whole, do on the whole satisfy. For example, we had no great demand for a change in the civil service right up until the middle 60s.
Well, is this a reflection on the lack of change in Irish society? Because in many ways, economically, culturally, the period from the 20s to the 50s saw very little change. And then since the beginning of the 60s, since the Lamassian era, for want of a better term, there's been very remarkable change in Ireland over the last 20 years.
Yes, there has, but if you look at it from now, it doesn't look as though those changes, that is very considerable industrialization, more people living in the towns, many more women working, the end of emigration, all those things, the turning of Ireland into a sort of standard Western European industrialized country, it doesn't look as though on the whole our institutions didn't fit those changes.
Of course, from an institutional point of view, the major change over the last 10 years between the first and second edition of the book has been the fact that we've joined the EEC. In the first edition in 1970, you were looking forward to this. Now, 7 or 8 years into EEC membership, almost 10 years into EEC membership, have we coped well with the EEC membership? Have our institutions been able to cope? And have our politicians responded to the extra demands made on them by EEC membership?
Well, we have coped with it quite well so far, but what I think you have to remember is that the first years of the European communities, and particularly the EEC, which is the one that really matters, the first years of that were a bonanza for us because we were bound to gain very considerably because of the common agricultural policy and the great boost that would give to agriculture. And one of the major changes of the 70s was the change in the agricultural community, enormous increase in wealth, though there are big ups and downs, as you may well remember. So that for the first few years, it was comparatively easy to feel that the thing was a success. The interesting thing to me, anyway, is that on the whole, we haven't had to do much so far, at least we haven't done very much, in making up new institutions to deal with this. We've permanent representation in Brussels, very efficient one, seems to work quite well. In some of the departments, you know, there are sections which deal with European affairs, but there are no great new institutions. There are some weaknesses here, I think, because just at the moment, the joint committee of the Dáil and Seanad on the EC affairs is looking at the relationships between the members of the European Parliament and our own members of the Oireachtas. And it's fairly clear, looking at other countries of the EEC, that there are very considerable connections there and tie-ins back into their own working arrangements, you know, their own committee system and things like that. But we don't have such a committee system, you see. Our Parliament isn't very much of a contributor to policy making, and therefore we so far haven't really found the need to set up that type of institution. Although the European parliamentarians themselves feel, I expect you remember my colleague David Thornley's phrase, he described himself and the other MEPs as the travelling people, and they do really feel very lost and out of things, you know.
You described the first years of our EEC membership as years in which the EEC was giving and we were receiving, and therefore in some sense rather easy years. But that climate has changed. We must now be into a period with an expanded EEC, with a different type of government in Germany, where it's going to be much harder to receive. Are you optimistic that we will be able to get what is there to be got by efficient administration, by efficient lobbying, etc.? Or are we going to have to work a lot harder and maybe change some of our institutions to see the best benefits for Ireland?
Well, we're going to have to work a lot harder. I'm quite clear about that. I mean, ministers will obviously have to pay very considerable amount of attention to that. And it may well be that some departments may need strengthening on account of this, because the demands in terms of time and coming and going. If you take, say, just recently, Mr. Daly, here at home, he needed to be in Brussels, and you have that type of thing going on all the time. And the interesting thing to me has been why those departments that have done a lot of, have to do a lot of that type of business, aren't more staffed up at ministerial level.
You identify throughout the two books, the first edition and the second edition, an underlying theme, and that is looking at Ireland as a democracy and asking how successful is it. And in some sense, I suspect the second book is slightly more critical than the first book, in that you're a little bit more pessimistic, perhaps, or a little bit less optimistic, that we are a successful democracy. In what way do you feel that this country is not succeeding as a democracy, or do you feel that at all?
Yes, well, I think I've probably been a bit more outspoken in the second book. I do think there are some points of criticism, and where we would need to take, we ought to take some sort of action. The obvious one is the one that's been getting a great deal of attention lately, and thank goodness, from parliamentarians themselves. If you take both in Fine Gael, Mr. Bruton, and the parliamentary reform paper that he prepared for Fine Gael, and Barry Desmond, are very critical of the role of the Oireachtas.
You yourself are very critical, though, because yes, you say that the Oireachtas doesn't initiate legislation. That comes from the cabinet. You say that they're not very efficient watchdogs over government. Right. They're not either very significant or worthwhile critics of government policy. Why have we got such a weak or ineffective Oireachtas?
Well, we took over the British system at a time when the British were in a phase where the cabinet very much dominated the parliamentary system, as it hadn't done earlier. And we took that over at that point. Now, the British have to some extent developed theirs, though not all that much, and certainly not to the extent to which many European parliaments are developed as policymakers, as lawmakers, and we really haven't developed ours at all. Our parliamentarians don't really make very much contribution, except possibly in a negative way, to legislation and to policy. It's brought in by a government that has a monopoly, really, of initiation, and it's the government expects to get it all through 100%. Feel very hurt if they don't.
Of course, this comes back to something which runs right through your book, and that is that our parliamentarians have such a strong sense of loyalty to their political party that this seems to transcend other loyalties they might have. They don't see themselves particularly as parliamentarians. They see themselves as members of Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael rather than as parliamentarians in some sense, and that loyalty to party is paramount, and that you won't disturb that in order to criticise something, even though the politician may feel that criticism ought to be made.
Yes. Well, the loyalty, is part of the tradition, I think, of our politics, and it obviously comes from the circumstances of the foundation of the state, and that sort of thing. But I think the important thing is a point I think you're really coming to there, and that is that the members of the Oireachtas don't really see themselves as legislators in the sense in which a member of Congress would see himself as a legislator. Government brings in, the President will bring in a proposal for legislation, and they will go to work and write a bill, putting in what they want in it, and he has to do deals with them.
Well, is that a constitutional thing, though? Because the American president has this independent power in the sense he is directly elected by the people, and the House of Congress or representatives, they can feel that the president is elected by the people. We can operate to a certain extent independently of him, but in the Irish system, as in the British system, our Taoiseach is elected by the Dáil, and therefore there's this kind of link of loyalty to the Taoiseach, which is necessary. which the Americans don't actually have.
We could put it up the other way, really, and say that after all, our TDs are elected by the people, and the government is a creation of theirs. Why then do they not control their governments more and have a bigger say? I think you could put it up that way. The fact is, we didn't develop in that way, and we haven't developed in that way.
To what extent is this this commitment to the party, is that due to the historical origins of the party, in the sense that they both emerged from the split over the treaty, and in the intensely emotional period of the 20s, I'm sure loyalty was absolutely paramount, because it was a matter of life and death, and indeed it literally was a civil war for part of the period, that in that period a concept of loyalty must have developed, which in some sense must be still with us.
Well, it seems to be disappearing if you look at what's been happening in Fianna Fáil, because one of the major changes, I suppose, over the last 10 to 15 years has been the growth of factions in Fianna Fáil. Now, that was appearing when I wrote the first edition. We'd already had 1969 and the arms crisis just coming up, although I wrote just about as that was occurring. Now, those divisions have in fact increased, and they've become not alone divisions between leaders, though that was the start of it, but those divisions have now gone back into the party, into the constituencies, and back among the party active workers, and perhaps back into the support to some extent. And that's, of course, one of the major changes, and that's a big change in Irish politics, to go back to where we started.
Yes. The change in Fianna Fáil, and it's difficult to talk very authoritatively because it's a process which is taking place, and we can't be sure where it's leading to. To what extent is that due to the change in leadership and style of leadership? And his power within the party, he was the founder of it, he was unchallenged leader of it, and when Lemass took over in '59, again, by then he was unchallenged. And these two men stand over the party, but subsequent leaders are very much elected in a contest and are among their equals. They don't stand out from the others. So in some sense, is it just simply that there is no longer the charismatic leader of Fianna Fáil, and what is there now is a man who's elected as a compromise in some cases, or is because he's supported by the larger faction, whereas there's a healthy minority supporting someone else?
Yes, well, I wish I'd just said all that, actually, because I think you know, you have the truth of it. De Valera, a messianic figure, towered above the rest, and Lemass was the Taoiseach, literally, and there's no question that he would take over. It's after that, so when you get the next leadership contest, and unhappily, that got tied up with Northern Ireland policy as well. So it's not only a dispute between leaders, but it's also a policy dispute, and to some extent it's deeper than that even, because I think it's part of the difference of opinion about the extent to which the party needed to modernise, you know, to bring its ideas up to date. I mean, the great success of Lemass, and to some extent Lynch, was to nudge the party towards a more realistic, or at least as I would think, a more realistic appreciation of the basic facts about Northern Ireland, the two traditions and the recognition of the two traditions, and the whole business that you aren't going to be able to coerce one of those traditions. They've got to agree to come over. Now, Lemass began that process, and Lynch, and what you got in mixed up with the difficulties over leadership was a difference of opinion between the old fundamentalists. I suppose Kevin Boland really epitomised that more than almost anybody, and a more, as I would think, up to date and indeed realistic view of the facts about the North.
Is there a second split within Fianna Fáil, though, and that is this, that the traditional image of Fianna Fáil was a party of the Irish people, with its emphasis on nationalist elements, its emphasis on language, a rural way of life as a superior way of life and a way of life to be promoted. And that was the image very much projected by Eamon de Valera. And then you get, in the post-war period, Fianna Fáil also becoming the party of the progressive businessmen, the party of Lemass and attracting foreign industry, etc. And in some sense, it's very hard to carry those two images simultaneously because they're almost contradictory. And can you at all perceive in the present divisions within Fianna Fáil those two wings still existing side by side and not really coalescing?
Yeah, well, once again, I mean, I think you have it right. You ought to be a professor of politics. The the old image of Fianna Fáil and the old aims were in fact to some extent then superseded. Once De Valera was in power, once he'd made the constitutional changes he wanted to change, it became quite clear that he wasn't really a revolutionary sort of figure. He was a very conservative and very conservative Catholic, and a joy to businessmen in a way, or at least Lemass was. And from at least from the early 40s, Fianna Fáil becomes a catch-all party. From that time onwards, you can see its support from being mainly country people and people who come from the country and that sort of thing. If that was true, and I think it probably was, it becomes a party which could attract more of almost every section of the community than any other party, and indeed almost a majority of most sections of the community.
This is the Fianna Fáil claim that they are almost Ireland, that they are the nation, that they gain support from every section of the population, whereas none of the other parties actually succeed in doing that.
That's right, but they didn't jettison wholly the old notions that what the party stands for. You know, the old nationalist ideas. These, in a sense, became sort of symbolic. They're useful as rallying cries, especially since some of them look as though they're really unrealizable. But you can always evoke support by reference to them. But it's not for nothing, you see, the party calls itself the party of reality. It was the party of reality. It adapted to be a catch-all party, thought of itself as a movement rather than a party. And that's why so many of the ordinary supporters of Fianna Fáil at the moment are extremely unhappy. I mean, a national movement doesn't have its leaders bickering in this factional sort of way.
To what extent is that unhappiness due to this concept of unfinished business? You mentioned Northern Ireland a few minutes ago, and in some sense, the traditional Fianna Fáil party would have put almost its first goal as the ending of partition, Irish unification. And yet, in many ways, that party went about building up a 26-county state, and it achieved its ambition within the 26 counties, and said all the time, well, we've also got to end partition, and Northern Ireland is always there. But no matter what you achieve within the 26 counties, in some sense there's unfinished business. And that Fianna Fáil are caught on that they have to say that whatever we achieve in the Republic of Ireland can only be incomplete because we have to achieve something for the 32 counties. And there is no indication at all anywhere that we're any nearer ending partition now than we were when Northern Ireland was established in 1921. In fact, in many ways, the longer it goes on, the less likely it is to change.
Well, that's right, and it doesn't alter the fact that to keep these aims in the forefront is still capable of evoking great support. If you look, say, back to the European parliamentary elections and Mr. Blaney's support, for example, in the West. Now, a lot of that is quite clearly people who had taken in, as they grew up, the basic aims, which are said to be national aims, and felt that Blaney really epitomized these more than anyone else. And many supporters of Fianna Fáil, I think, they are traditional supporters of Fianna Fáil, but might well have been rather unhappy at the way Fianna Fáil has been going. They have in a way to be weaned towards the more realistic appreciation of the facts about the North. And that, of course, is one of the big changes again since I wrote last time. At that time, Lemass had been engaged in it, and Lynch was engaged in it, but I think there's a far greater appreciation of the major facts about the North than there was then. But you still have to recognize that there are a large number of people who find it hard enough to come to terms with that, I think.
The fact that Fine Gael under Dr. Garrett Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald would also place the North as quite important in his ambitions and his goals. But his approach on the Northern issue would be quite significantly different than, for example, Charles Haughey. Is that a recognition by Fitzgerald that you cannot hope to be a majority party unless you keep Northern policy somewhere fairly prominent in your party aims?
No, I think in Fitzgerald's case, it's a very deep, personal, emotional thing. He constantly refers to his parents, and he says, and I mean I know he's quite sincere about this, that this is one of the things he's come into politics to try to do something about. And if you remember his Towards New Ireland, is that what it was called?
Mm-hmm,
yes.
Yes.
In the early 70s,
Mm-hmm.
he analyzes there what it would be necessary for this state to do in order to have a hope of weaning Northern Protestants, and he lays it all out, and that leads to the whole thing about constitutional change and to the difference between Fianna Fáil on the one hand and Fine Gael on the other about the timing of constitutional change.
It's been a very frequently discussed topic over the 10 years between the two books, the Constitution and the need to reform it. And yet, if you look at the end of the decade, there's been very little change in the Constitution, a lot of talk and very little action. To what extent is this that we're interested in talking about the subject, but we don't really want to grasp any nettles, and that it's nice to be able to discuss it perhaps at leisure or in a pub or something like that. But there's very little real effort to go out and change the Constitution, to bring in something which might be more attractive to Northerners.
Well, I think it's a matter of political leadership and what political leaders think they can do. If you go back to the late 60s and the growing recognition that in order to solve that problem, there would have to be changes. Now, very many political leaders accepted that at the time, and there was the whole business about Article 44 and the special position of the Church. And when Cardinal Conway gave the all clear there, we were able to make that change. Now,
did we have to wait for Cardinal Conway to be able to bring about that change? Is this not an example of lack of political leadership, that politicians wait until they got the nod from Armagh that it was okay to go ahead? It's
a recognition of one of the facts of life, that in certain areas the support of the Church is necessary for a very good reason, and that is that most people will take their lead from the Church in some areas. And in fact, you can see that there, because in 1972 we did make that change. There was a lot of talk at that time, if you read the politicians' speeches, all about the need to take out a lot of things out of our Constitution, and that really meant stuff about divorce and that sort of thing.
But that's something we haven't grasped.
Yes.
And yet the opinion polls, if you're to believe them, suggest that the figures for or against divorce are very close, and that it certainly would be a possibility, if there was a referendum on the issue of divorce, that it just might get carried. It looks very close at the moment.
There's more of a possibility that it wouldn't go through. That's the point.
Do we have to wait for a nod from our Catholic bishops? Because that nod will never be coming. I mean, if you're anticipating some change in the Constitution on an issue like divorce, obviously Rome or the bishops are not going to support it. So are the politicians down here not going to have enough courage, if they believe in it, which one doesn't know necessarily?
Well, you say they're not going. You say they're not going to, but in fact, the long-term trend of opinion is clear, and that is that more and more people are gradually turning over to being in favour of some sort of arrangement, both about, say, divorce, contraception. Well, we leave abortion out of it. Now, and you can see that, and you can see the differences if you look at the poll evidence. The younger people, and if you take, say, contraception, people in the the women in the childbearing group, in those sort of ages, there are many more of them in favour than against. If you, older people, fewer of them, country people less, but it's gradually changing, and that I think that change will continue till you'll come one day when, you know, there are enough people to make it possible to make the change. At that point, the politicians, I think, will be able to make the change. And at that point, the church will do as it always does. It will accommodate to that change. Possibly not happily, because as you know, the church has a sort of a domino theory view of these changes. Divorce, contraception, abortion, and you know, you're on a very slippery path. And they may be right about that.
You identify in your book a trend towards secularism, a trend towards secularist values, and in some sense, there's a feeling that maybe this is inevitable. That Ireland was different from mainland Europe because we were rural, because we were living, relatively speaking, in poverty, because we had very strong Catholic Church, etc. But the experience over the last 20 years has been urbanization, considerable growth in affluence, considerable increase in levels of education, etc. And one would expect, going with that, a change in attitudes. Is it inevitable that this will lead to more secular attitudes? And if it does it inevitably mean that the Church is going to be, the Catholic Church is going to be in conflict with politicians in the decade to come, because politicians will be responding, one anticipates, to those changes?
Well, they will not be apostles for those changes, of course not, because that is to attenuate the role of religion and the rest of it. But if you think back, say, to the position of the Catholic Church and whether the state should support it, its special position and all that. If you go back, say, 30, 40 years, it was inconceivable that the church was going to soften on that. But the church itself, after all, had its great reappraisal with the Second Vatican Council and Aggiornamento, and it altered altered its views, changed course on a number of these things. Now, though the church doesn't stay stable, not that it stays stable, but it doesn't stay absolutely unchanging. It will alter as circumstances require, while trying to hold as much of the essentials, the basic essentials, as possible. And there's no reason to think in the long run that won't happen here. I think it will. As to whether the society will become more secular, well, all the evidence from the most industrialized countries is that does tend to happen. Now, perhaps it need not happen, but it looks as though it does, and we're already on that down that road.
One political institution you identify in your book for particular criticism is the ordinary TD, and you're very critical of the perceived function, both by the public and by the TD himself or herself, of their role. And you suggest that they perceive their role as involving themselves in administrative affairs, that they're a kind of a contact man between administration and the constituents. And in some sense, I think you're suggesting this is a fairly dishonest role, because in many cases, if the administration was efficient and if the ordinary public could get justice, there wouldn't be any need for this contact man at all, that if one went to one administrator, one would get what one wanted if one was entitled to it. And the local TD seems to almost get in the way there and claim in some sense that he has delivered, that if you hadn't gone to him or to her, that the constituent wouldn't receive it. Is this true?
No, I don't think that is quite true. There is that element of it, and I would be critical of that, all right. I can see the value of that type of activity. You know, people need it. In the modern welfare state, it's very big, it's very complex, and many people do need some help.
But should it be political?
Now, well, should TDs do it?
Yeah.
Yes, that is it.
Couldn't an ombudsman or a citizens advice bureau
do some of
do
those
it?
things? Yes, yes. I used to argue with David Thornley about that. I can remember he came one morning with a terrible headache, he had a hangover actually, and I said, where'd you get that? And he said, I was up at the Coolock Ladies Club, he said. You know, he had a very fine tenor voice. And he said, I was up at the Coolock Ladies Club, he said. I sang a few operatic arias. And I said, well, how in God's name do you get a head like that singing a few operatic arias? And he said, well, he said, I was really a succès fou, he said, especially I did Tauber's girls were made to love and kiss. He said to sing that twice, he said. And I still said, well, how did you get? He said, well, I went off, he said, with the PP afterwards, and, you know, one thing led to another. And he said, you have to remember, Chubb, he said, that academics like yourself, he said, you're always terribly critical of this type of activity, he said, but that's what practical politics is about. And to some extent, that's true. With our election system, you know, they have to do this sort of thing, and I can see value in it. What I don't see is why they can't combine that type of activity with being policy oriented as well. Many of them have. Many of the modern generation are doing just that. They have to be better organized. They need better resources. What has happened, though, and this again is another, we're coming back to your very original question, one of the changes of recent years has been the ruthless exploitation of this. That is to especially by ministers who engage in it in themselves to a very considerable extent, and we now have the position where ministers in their private offices, that's their secretariats, will have perhaps up to half a dozen people dealing with this type of constituency work, not only their own constituency, but constituency questions, you know, that their party colleagues bringing into them. And
it's hard not to believe that in some sense that's fundamentally dishonest
yes,
what they're doing, isn't it?
Well, certainly those who don't have that advantage, and they're spending state money at it, who don't have that advantage, their colleagues, the opposition side would say so. And I think this is the point I'm making, is that it has become ruthlessly exploited now. And I think also there are some signs that it goes too far, in the sense that there is, I think, a lot more than there ever was of trying actually to affect administrative decisions, not just the pace of them and to get the thing out a bit quicker, but to... in favour, yes. And if you take things, say, like trying to get people off smuggling charges, customs, trying to affect the promotion in the guards, or trying to get people off charges. Well, here RTE had a very good thing of it was Oliver Flanagan. Every handshake counts. You made a program called Every Handshake Counts, and in that Neelan is talking to Oliver Flanagan, and he's sitting at his desk in his house, and he's looking at his correspondence. And he, and of course, he's a consummate actor, Mr. Flanagan, as you know. He picked up a letter, and he says, "Oh dear, the poor fellow," he said. "Now listen to this one, Ted." And he read out this letter, you see, which said, "Dear Oliver," he said, "I'm going to be prosecuted," he said, "for being at a cockfight," he said. "I was at a cockfight after Mass last Sunday, and I had my name taken," he said, "and I wonder if you could do something about it." And Flanagan says, "Oh, the poor fellow, when I'm over in Mount Mellick tomorrow, I'll have a word with the inspector." Now, that is part of the job, in a way, but that type of thing verges near to, I think, something that shouldn't be happening, and it is happening. It happens very much more now than it did. You know, there are quite a lot of, I think it was in the middle of 1980, some of this came into the Dáil about making inquiries about civil service commission appointments, you know, in order to try to be ahead with the news. And I think the customs, the man who was the secretary of the customs officers, he was challenged by a minister about that and said, "Well, look, you know, if you raise this question anymore, I'll be down on Wednesday with all the cases down at your front door, you know, down in your office, and how do you like that?" And we all know it goes on.
Does this make you pessimistic about the future of Irish democracy? Because we're obviously entering into a very difficult period. We're going to enter into a period where there's going to continue to be high unemployment. There's going to continue to be a great deal of political dissatisfaction. I think all the political parties are worried about this. If there is, perhaps, maybe putting it too strongly, low standards in high places, are we going to have difficulties over the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, I would think this one is a minor difficulty in a way, and it may well be that the public may react, you know, in another direction, that they may in fact feel, you know, that this goes too far. All right, yes, I am somewhat pessimistic, but I would think on much more general grounds, you yourself referred to unemployment. It's perfectly clear that, you know, we are now in a situation where we have to make very considerable structural changes in order to deal with this. It's not going to go away if we have pay restraint just. You know, that's only a start. It isn't going to, hardly going to touch the thing, really. Now, if we're going to have long-term unemployment, particularly unemployment in the young, then it may well be that we're going to have much more radical politics. You can already see this with the rise of the Workers' Party. To some extent, they reflect, I think, this dissatisfaction, and of course, as many would think, the failure of the Labour Party, in particular, you know, to satisfy their aspirations. Now, you may well have even more radical politics, I think, if you have long-term unemployment and hopelessness with a lot of young people, and I think that's a very real problem we are facing into.
Professor Chubb, on that note, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.